The air crackled with tension as Officer Daniel Hargrove's flashlight beam cut through the dusk, pinning an elderly black man against the brick wall of a quiet alley. "Hands up now," he barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through the evening stillness. It was a routine patrol in a neighborhood Hargrove had always eyed with suspicion, a place where his biases whispered that trouble lurked in every shadow. The man before him, dressed in a simple overcoat, stood with a quiet dignity that seemed to mock Hargrove's authority. His hands rose slowly, not out of fear, but with a deliberate calm that unnerved the young officer. Hargrove's pulse raced, his grip tightening on the pistol now drawn and aimed. He'd seen this before, so he thought. An older man, alone, in a part of town where Hargrove stereotypes painted everyone as a threat. "Don't move," he snapped, his voice betraying a tremor of adrenaline. The man's eyes, deep and unyielding, met Hargrove's with a weight that felt like judgment. "Son," the man said softly, "you don't know who you're pointing that at." The words hung in the air, steady and unafraid, but Hargrove dismissed them as defiance, his finger twitching near the trigger. The alley was a narrow trap of cracked pavement and graffiti-stained walls, the kind of place where Hargrove's training told him to expect the worst. He'd grown up hearing stories of those people causing trouble, and years on the force had only hardened his assumptions. Black skin, to him, meant danger, especially here, where poverty and crime were the only stories he chose to see. The man's coat was too neat, his posture too composed, and that only fueled Hargrove's suspicion. "Who are you, huh? What's your business here?" he demanded, stepping closer, his gun steady but his heart pounding with a mix of fear and control. The elderly man, whose name was Clarence Monroe, didn't flinch. At 72, he'd faced worse than a shaky officer with a gun. Decades ago, he'd walked through fire-segregated schools, courtroom battles, and a career that carried him to the highest bench in the land. As a Supreme Court justice, Clarence had spent his life dismantling the very prejudices now staring him down through Hargrove's weapon. But here, in this alley, he was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong timer, so Hargrove thought. "I'm walking home," Clarence said, his voice low but firm, each word measured like a verdict. "That's my business." Hargrove scoffed, his lip curling. "Walking home? You expect me to believe that? Empty your pockets. Now." His tone was laced with contempt, the kind that came from years of unchecked assumptions. Clarence's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. He'd seen this look before on sheriffs in the 60s, on colleagues who underestimated him, on a world that too often judged him by his skin. Slowly, he reached into his coat, pulling out a slim wallet. Hargrove's grip tightened, expecting a weapon, but Clarence only held the wallet out, his gaze never wavering. "Open it," Hargrove ordered, his voice sharp but less certain now. Clarence complied, revealing an ID that glinted under the flashlight's beam. Hargrove snatched it, his eyes scanning the text. His brow furrowed, then his face paled. "Justice Clarence Monroe, Supreme Court." The words stumbled out, barely audible, as the weight of his mistake crashed over him like a tidal wave. The gun in his hand suddenly felt heavier, his authority crumbling under the truth. This wasn't just any man, this was a pillar of justice, a legend whose name echoed in law schools and history books. Hargrove's mind reeled. He'd heard of Justice Monroe, the first black man to sit on the Supreme Court in decades, a figure whose rulings had shaped the nation. And here he was, standing in an alley, staring down the barrel of Hargrove's prejudice. This can't be right," Hargrove stammered, his voice cracking. Clarence's expression didn't change, but his eyes held a quiet fire. "It's right," he said simply, "and you're wrong." The words cut deeper than any bullet, exposing the raw nerve of Hargrove's bias. For a moment, the alley was silent, save for the distant hum of city traffic. Hargrove lowered his gun, his hands trembling. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. Clarence stepped forward, his presence commanding despite his age. "You think you're protecting this city," he said, his voice steady but heavy with disappointment. "But you're fighting the wrong enemy. The real threat isn't might's the hate you carry." Hargrove's face burned, shame and defensiveness warring within him. He'd never been called out like this, not so directly, not by someone whose authority dwarfed his own. Clarence turned to leave, his steps slow but purposeful. Hargrove stood frozen, the ID still clutched in his hand. He wanted to call out, to say some anything, but the weight of his actions pinned him in place. The alley seemed to close in around him, the graffiti on the walls screaming truths he'd ignored for years. He'd always seen himself as the good guy, the protector, but now he saw the shadow of his own prejudice reflected in Clarence's departing figure. As Clarence disappeared around the corner, Hargrove sank against the wall, his breath shallow. The ID slipped from his fingers, landing on the cracked pavement. He'd crossed a line tonight, one he couldn't uncross. The city hummed on, indifferent to the reckoning unfolding in that alley. But for Hargrove, the world had shifted. He'd pointed a gun at justice itself, and justice had stared back, unyielding. The next morning, Hargrove sat in his patrol car, the memory of the previous night burning in his chest. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Justice Monroe's face, calm, resolute, and damning. The precinct buzzed around him, officers trading jokes and paperwork, but Hargrove felt like an outsider in his own world. He'd always believed he was doing right, upholding order, but now his badge felt like a lie. He kept replaying Clarence's words. "The real threat is the hate you carry." They echoed like a verdict he couldn't appeal. He hadn't reported the incident. What could he say? That he'd drawn his weapon on a Supreme Court justice because of his own assumptions? The thought made his stomach churn. But silence wasn't absolution. Hargrove knew he'd been wrong deeply, unforgivably wrong, and the weight of it was crushing. He glanced at the dashboard, where Justice Monroe's ID still sat, a silent accusation. He hadn't returned it. Not yet. It was his only tether to the man who'd exposed the cracks in his worldview. Across town, Clarence Monroe sat in his study, the morning light filtering through heavy curtains. His hands, steady despite their age, held a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He wasn't shaken by the encounter, faced too many guns, too many slurs, to be rattled now. But he was tired. Tired of a world that still saw his skin before his character, his age before his accomplishments. He'd spent decades fighting for justice, only to be reduced to a suspect in an alley. The irony wasn't lost on him. Clarence's phone buzzed, a call from a colleague on the bench. "You okay, Clarence?" the voice asked, warm but concerned. Word had spread not through Hargrove, but through a bystander who'd seen the confrontation and recognized the justice. Clarence sighed, his voice steady but heavy. "I'm fine. Just another day in America." He didn't need pity. He needed change. And change, he knew, started with truth. Back at the precinct, Hargrove's sergeant called him in. "Heard you had a run-in last night," the older man said, his tone gruff but curious. Hargrove froze, his heart pounding. Had someone reported him? The sergeant leaned back, eyeing him. "Word is you stopped Justice Monroe. Care to explain?" Hargrove's mouth went dry. He could lie, claim it was routine, but the truth clawed at him. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The sergeant raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting. Hargrove spilled at all the alley, the gun, the assumptions that had driven him. His voice shook as he spoke, not from fear of punishment, but from the shame of confronting his own flaws. The sergeant listened, his face unreadable. When Hargrove finished, the older man leaned forward. "You're lucky he didn't press charges," he said. "But this isn't about luck. It's about you figuring out why you did it and making sure it never happens again." That evening, Hargrove drove to Justice Monroe's home, a modest brownstone in a quiet neighborhood. The ID sat heavy in his pocket, a reminder of his failure. He knocked, his hands sweating, unsure what he'd say. Clarence opened the door, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Officer," he said, his voice neutral. Hargrove swallowed, holding out the ID. "I came to return this," he said, his voice cracking. "And to apologize." Clarence took the ID, his eyes studying Hargrove. "An apology doesn't erase what happened," he said, not harshly but with the weight of experience. But it's a start. The question is, what will you do with it? Hargrove looked down, the question cutting deeper than he'd expected. He didn't have an answer, not yet. But for the first time, he wanted to find one. Over the weeks that followed, Hargrove couldn't shake the encounter. He started noticing things he'd ignored before, the way he tensed around certain faces, the assumptions he made without thinking. He began reading, listening, trying to understand the history he'd never been taught. It was slow, painful work, unlearning the biases woven into his life. He volunteered for community outreach, sat in on talks about systemic racism, and faced uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he served. Clarence, meanwhile, continued his work on the bench, his rulings as sharp and principled as ever. He didn't dwell on the alley, but he carried it with him, a reminder of why he fought, why justice mattered. One day, a letter arrived at his home, handwritten from Hargrove. It was brief but raw, detailing the officer's struggle to change, to see the world differently. "I don't expect forgiveness," it read, "but I'm trying to be better." Clarence read it twice, then set it aside. He didn't reply. Some things, he knew, were answered not in words, but in actions. Years later, Hargrove stood before a group of new recruits, his badge no longer a shield but a responsibility. He told them about the night he pointed a gun at a Supreme Court justice, not to scare them, but to warn them. "We carry power," he said, his voice steady now, "but it's nothing if we don't carry truth." Somewhere, Clarence Monroe sat in his chambers, preparing for another case, his life a testament to the fight for a better world, one alley, one truth, one step at a time. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.